Hi, welcome to this mastering tutorial. I just want to say that mastering your own work, some people frown upon, and I'm actually quite happy to master my own work, and I'm quite happy with the results of it. Some of the arguments against mastering your own songs and your own music is that by mastering your own music, you've lost all objectivity, and that you can't hear things and problems in your song that you've gotten used to. I kind of agree with that. My answer to that is if you were to master your own songs, do it a couple of days after you've mixed your song. My other suggestion is that when you're mixing your songs, you get your mix to sound exactly the way you want it to sound. Mastering's not a problem-solving exercise. It's more of a icing on the cake exercise. It's something that you do to just bring your production up to that next level. With all the new streaming services that we have available to us now, whether it's Spotify, even YouTube, we have a situation where you need to know how to optimize your audio so that the streaming services are compliant with them for a start, and two, that they sound good. Mastering engineers now know how to do that really well. That's probably what they do best. What I want to do here is I just want to show you how you can master your own music, get it to a reasonable standard, and I'm going to show you a method that I've stolen from Shepard, and you really want to look this guy up. Just type Shepard in a YouTube search bar and he'll come up. He is the ultimate resource when it comes to home mastering. What I've done is I've stolen a method from him which generally will get your production up to a standard that would be acceptable with these streaming services. I think one other thing you've got to remember about streaming services now is that the loudness wars have pretty much been killed off by them, but just simply because they bring your music up to the same level, or they try to. They do a pretty good job of it, to be honest. So what we want to do is we want to get our music to what Shepard calls the sweet spot, and that's the spot where you've not losing out on the dynamics of your song, but you've still got your song up to a commercially acceptable loudness. So I'm going to use one of my songs called I Wonder. Here we go. Just going to bring it in. Now you just want to make sure that you're not warping. So we turn warp off here, because we don't really care about the metronome. We're not going to bother with that. Let's just have a quick listen to the way it is now. We'll get up to a section. So you can see it's pretty quiet. There's lots of headroom. The headroom just means there's a gap. That gap between there and there is quite large. All right. When I mix my music, I tend to try and keep quite a lot of headroom, and I do that by bringing all my levels down. When you come to this section here, bringing all my levels down to about -12. But for this sake, we're going to keep it at 0. So I've broken down mastering down into a few essential steps. There's a couple of optional steps that you can take, but as a general rule, this will get your music to a reasonably good quality. I will say, towards the end of the video, when we get to the limiting stage, there is a third-party plugin that I suggest you buy, and it's the only one. It is from Klanghelm, and it's a VU meter, and I'll show you how I use that and why I use that towards the end of the video, but we were not there yet. Let's start at the very beginning. So what's our first step? Our first step is we want to do a general EQ. This is an EQ that you can pretty much use on every song, and what it does is, now that we're honorary mastering engineers, we don't think in left and right panning anymore. That doesn't exist in a vocabulary. The way we think about music and sound when we're in the mastering stage as we think about it, mids and sides. Now the mids simply mean everything that's in the middle, and the sides, let's just envisage a column going straight out from your head, right? Anything that sounds like it's coming from the outside of that column is the sides, and anything from the inside is the mids. Now this is handy when we come to the Ableton's EQ. We're actually able to use, see we're in stereo mode here, we're actually able to click that into mid-side mode. What it enables us to do is it enables us to EQ separately the mids and the sides. So our first move is a simple one. We're just going to cut with a 4-pole everything from 30 Hz down. There's nothing really audible down in that zone, and by cutting from 30 Hz down, you can actually make your mixes sound tighter and actually make them sound bigger by having less noise under the 30 Hz. Generally, as a rule, there's a kind of nasty spot around about 3, 4, getting close, probably not so much around 500 Hz. Around that area is a kind of nasally, horrible, nasty sound. And you can imagine it coming from someone's nose like, oh. That noise is terrible to our ears. So generally my first move is just to around, you can tune this to taste. I think it's important to note that any EQ moves that we're doing in mastering stage are very broad strokes and very small moves. You can hear the difference between that, and I'll show you that. This is bypassed, and this is in. It's really subtle, but every move that we're going to do in this tutorial is subtle. It's the accumulation of all these subtle moves that culminate into a huge move, if that makes sense. Now, I think the cue's just a little bit too wide there, so. Now, because we're only working in the mid section here, I kind of want all the higher frequencies to tame them a little bit. And it's okay. I know you're thinking, oh, but we want that sheen. Well, we do want that sheen, but we don't want it in the middle of our spectrum. We kind of want it on the sides. So when we get to the sides, which is this EQ here, I just did that by tapping on the M. That brings these guys into play. Let's do that now, actually. So from 3, we're just going to drag in, just not the 4-pole, we're just going to drag in a nice gentle slope. I'm pretty aggressive with this move. I kind of think anything, because we've got a nice slope here, anything under 200, you're kind of still getting the 100s and the 150s. You're still getting those frequencies, but just a lot less of them. And so what we want to do is cut anything in this area. We don't want that in our side information. Our sides are meant to be crisp and clear, and so that's what that's doing. That's cutting all of these frequencies out. And so what we want to do is we just want to bring in a shelf, as you can see here, and just lift them up a little. Give it that sheen from about 1,000 onwards, 1,500 maybe. Let's have a listen to that. That's on, off. It's pretty subtle, but you can hear it kind of tightens up the mix. It brings out the sheen around the outsides of the mix, and it kind of just brings everything together. So that brings us to our second move. Now, usually, our second move would be a glue compressor. And what we'd do with the glue compressor is we would find the catch peaks mastering preset. And then what we'd aim for is we'd bring this threshold down, so we're just kissing about 2 decibels, 1 to 2 decibels of gain reduction in this meter here. Something like that. So what that's doing is anytime a sound gets towards the top of the threshold, it's bringing the volume down. But the problem I find that the glue compressor has, and a lot of broadband compressors, and what I mean by that is that what it does is, let's say it catches a peak, it brings the volume down, but it also brings the volume down of everything. So everything comes down in volume. That's kind of not what we want. I don't think anyway. I think there's a better way to do this. And we can do that by using a multiband compressor. Now what a multiband compressor does is it's a pretty scary sounding and looking plugin, but really all it is 3 compressors. This compressor here is compressing anything from 120 Hz down. So anytime something peaks above the threshold that we're going to set, around 120 Hz, it's only going to affect from 120 Hz down. The high section from 2.5 kHz up. So anything above 2.5 kHz, the threshold that we set, if it hits the peak of that, it's going to just bring those frequencies down. I reckon that's a much better technique than using a glue compressor, and this is how we set it. At the moment there's pretty much no ratio, so if we click inside the square and drag towards the right, you'll see, drag downwards, sorry. When you drag downwards, you see the ratio starts to get really high. Now what we want is we just want a reasonably low ratio. When you bring the cursor across and it looks like a bracket like that, just bring it in till we're getting around about a decibel, maybe a little bit more of gain reduction. So what we want to do is we want to do that with every band. So just bring the ratio down up a little, find the bracket. Look, it's already doing around about half a decibel of gain reduction. And just do the same with this one. Nice low ratio. This one takes a lot more energy to produce higher frequencies than it does lower frequencies. So you can actually push this one a little bit further. There you go. Now, you can play around with these settings if you like. Generally, I like a pretty fast attack time. That's what this is. So what attack time means is when the volume hits and peaks above the threshold, how fast is the compressor going to react to that? And then this one here is the release time, and what that tells the compressor is once as a compressor I have pulled down the volume, how long does it take me to bring the volume back up to its normal level? So I think a fast attack time and a reasonably fast, moderately fast type release time is pretty cool. So we know we're doing about 1.4, 1.42, that's probably a bit too much. You can get away with that, but you might as well drag it down, it's not going to hurt. So let's add those dBs that we're taking away. Okay. Now I'm going to group all of these, and the reason I'm going to do that by clicking on this one, clicking the shift button and clicking on that one, then right click, go group, or option G. I think it's become control G on Windows. That brings it all into a group. Now, the reason I'm doing this in a group, I'll explain a bit later. But for now, we're going to go into our next step. Our next step is saturation. So let's me stop my video here, and by the magic of television, I'll open up a new project and explain to you saturation. Okay, so I've just opened up a blank project. That's just my vocals there. So what I'm going to do is this section here, we're just going to add a new MIDI clip, like so. And we're just going to add one big MIDI note from C2 onwards, just like so. So we'll play that. You get nothing. Now, just come into our instruments, grab an operator. We just want a single operator. And then all that's going to do is just going to give us a sine wave, just a single note, like so. Now, the problem I'm having, and maybe someone can tell me in the comments why this might be happening, is when I bring a spectrum in, and make it big so you can see, what I'm expecting to see is one large bump with a smooth line all the way down, because it's just a single sine wave, just one single harmonic. But what I'm getting is this here. Now what I think this is I think it's what's called aliasing, but I can't be sure. But for this test it's not so great. So what I've done is I'm going to use a Voxengo span. Now this is a free plugin and it's fantastic. It lets you see what's going on in your with your sounds. So if we play this now, we'll get the bump and the nice smooth curve all the way down. In fact, you don't even get the curve in this one. So this is much better for our needs. So let's just close that off. After the span, I'm going to put a utility. Now the reason I'm going to do this is we don't particularly want to hear the note, because what we're going to do is we're going to crank our saturation plugins as hard as they will go just to see their effect. So we'll do that now. Let's grab a saturator. We'll just use the bit warmer preset for now because that's my favourite set. And you can see it's adding 6 dBs. So now you can hear it. Very dull now. But the signal coming in to the Voxengo span is still as strong as it was. And there you are. You can see that the saturation plugin has added an extra harmonic. Now, you can just see the button down here. I'm going to crank it up as loud as it will go. So you can see what effect that's having. Now, of course, there are other types of saturation and distortion here. One's an analog clip. You can see a lot more denser harmonics in the upper spectrum there. Soft sine. So similarities, less but more dense, much more dense but less intense. So I'm not going to go through them all. You can do that yourself if you feel so inclined. But what I do want to show you is that you can do this test for any of your plugins, including your third-party plugins. So here's a free plugin that's absolutely awesome. It's called Saturation Knob by Softube. It's just a single knob with highs, naturals and lows. What I want to show you with this one is something really important. Let me just show you what we've got so far. So if I bring that up, you can see it's acting similar to what our Ableton saturation plugin was doing. But now if I click this on to keep low, see that there? That's going to be very important a bit later. You can understand why I do things that I do because of that bump right there. as well as all of these saturations here. Now, just for a little bit of fun, here's another free plugin. Now, I'm not sure whether this one's still free or whether I managed to snap it up as a free promotion. I'm not sure, but if you go to their website, Plugin Alliance Unfiltered Audio Ident. Let's try that one. So this is more of a clipper than a saturation plugin, and it kind of does a similar thing, but in a different way. But the end result, as you're about to see, is actually quite similar. There we are, added harmonics. Added harmonics. Hard clip. Overfold. So you can do this test with any of your third-party plugins. You can see exactly, if you crank it up as high as you will go, you can get an idea of what it is your plugin's actually doing. I mean, that's just one facet of what it's doing. That's what's adding harmonics. Some saturation plugins and some plugins actually add noise as well, which you won't see as much with the span, but maybe I can show you that in a different video. So let's go back to our other project now and we'll continue on. Okay, so we're back into the original project now. So knowing what we know, this is a totally optional section of the mastering process. You can do this, or sometimes you might not want to do this. I find that in most cases, a small amount of saturation is pleasing. So, the problem that we have with saturation is it adds gain, and what our brains tend to do when we hear something that's louder is we have this natural inclination to believe that it's somehow better, even when it's not. And that's the danger with saturation here. So what I like to do is I like to level match before I make any decisions on whether I'm keeping this section of the chain or not. And you can do this by ear. A good starting point is if you're adding 6 dB of gain, just start with 6 dB, negative dB of output gain. That's pretty close. It's probably a little bit louder. Let's just bring it down a bit. That's pretty close. So, what you want to listen to here is you want to hear where the upper parts, because it's as we saw in that last video, it's doing a lot of work in those upper harmonics. Also remember, it's doing a little bit of work in the lower as well, and that's something you really need to keep an eye on. So just listen to how it brings out the snare, how it brings especially out all the cymbals. So just listen to the cymbals especially. Kind of gives it a crunch, kind of gives it a grime. Now that may be or may not be what you're after. If you're not after it, don't use it. Okay, there's no rules that saying that you have to saturate it. I kind of like it a little bit. Probably not as much as that. So I might just drag it down a little bit. Drag my output up a little bit. I like that. Now, remember how we grouped these little guys here? The reason I grouped these little guys here is because I want to do this exact process again after my saturation. The reasons why is because we're adding harmonics to our signal. We're adding upper harmonics, but we're also adding lower harmonics. And even though you may not see them on a spectrum analyzer, you may not perceive that you're hearing them, those lower frequencies could now be reintroduced, and we don't want that. So the simplest way to do this is you have the saturation plugin at the end of your chain, and you have this audio effect rack at the beginning. If we click on the Alt button, and then, let me start again. If you click on the Alt button, and then click on the audio effect unit, and drag it past the saturation plugin, you're going to have that same effect. Now, the EQ is okay, we can keep that. Probably you could drag this down, because you probably don't need those extra frequencies now, and you could probably bring the mid ones back up, because you probably don't need to cut as many of those now. And also, you just want to make sure that you're doing the correct gain reduction in your multiband. That's okay in my book. So with this processing here and this saturation here, if we bypass these and bring them in one by one, just without saturation, EQ and dynamics. Now I'm going to double click these so that they're minimized, like so, just so that we can see a bit more. Now our next step is also an optional step. Now, with power comes great responsibility, and this is one of those situations where you want to be careful, really careful, but you also can use it as a very worthwhile tool. What we're going to do is if you want to, we're going to widen our mix. Widening can be detrimental. You can believe that you're improving things by making them incredibly wide. You're essentially ruining your stereo field. So we're going to do the things a little bit differently here. We're going to bring an audio effect rack, and now we're going to bring in a utility. And what we're going to do here is we're going to do things slightly different. I'm going to drag a utility in here. We're going to open up this button here, opens up the audio effect rack. That there is a utility. We're going to rename this by pressing Command R, and we're going to call this wet, like so. Now we're going to create a chain. We're going to keep that absolutely blank. There's absolutely no effects on this one. And we're going to call this dry. So essentially what we have now is we have two chains. One has a utility, one has absolutely no processing at all. What we're going to do is we're going to bring the volume of the wet all the way down. Here you see a width knob. Now this does two things. If we bring this down, that narrows it down to mono. So that essentially is a mono signal. But we want to do the opposite. We want to bring this all the way up to 200%. And what that's done has it's stripped most of the information from the mid section, and basically all you're hearing is the sides. So what you have is you have a signal signal comes out through this way, right? The dry comes back at nominal value. It comes up at unity gain. What we want to do is we just want to bring the wet in to taste, and that's going to widen our mix. But what it's going to do is, instead of, if I just had this utility all by itself and just did the width to taste, what it's actually doing is stripping some of that mid information out. And we don't want that. We want our mid to be exactly the way it is. We don't want to touch that. All we want to do is add a little bit more to the sides if we want it. And that's what this system does. So I'm going to play it now, and then with this button here, I'm just going to bring it up, and if you've got headphones on, or if you've got a good monitoring system, you should hear things widen out a little bit, but you will also hear that the mid section is untouched. You hear that? Now I'm going to take it all the way so you can definitely hear it. See, that's way too much. My rule of thumb here is bring it up till you think you're hearing it widen and leave it there. That's if you tend to push it any further, it kind of makes things too wide and it just sounds a bit odd. You might not think it sounds a bit odd, but later on when you listen to it later, you'll go, something just a bit weird about that. And that's generally what it is your widening effect. Now comes our last step of the chain, which is the step that everyone loves. I'm going to show you two different ways of doing this. The first way is just the general way of doing it, and that's bringing your limiter. The ceiling, the nominal value for your ceiling is -1 dB. Now the reason we go for -1 dB has to do with, I believe, I'm not exactly sure, from what I've read, -1 dB is the nominal value for iTunes especially. So if we bring that to -1, and the idea with this is it's going to get loud now, by the way, so just adjust your speakers if you have to. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the gain up until I start seeing a little bit of action, a little bit of gain reduction happening in here. It's not actually gain reduction, it's brick wall limiting. So what it's doing is it's catching those peaks and chopping them off totally. You can imagine that you don't really want to be chopping into your audio too much. What I might do is I might pump it up. What I might do actually is we'll bring in a utility, like we did in the last video, and then we'll bring the gain down a little bit. So 24 dB, and bring the gain up 24 dB. Now this could be loud, so just be careful. It's an undesirable sound. Yeah, it's probably a bit too much gain reduction there. What I'll do is I'll group these like so, and then I can bypass both of them together. So that's 12 dBs. So what essentially doing is squashing your mix by 12 dBs. That's horrible. The best way to do this is to just bring your gain up to just see the thing kissing. Like so. So you can hear we're not really destroying any of our sound quality. Right? But when I take the utility away, we're loud. So remember earlier I was telling you that you should buy this plugin. This plugin is from Klanghelm. It only costs, I think, $5. Do a Google search for it, you'll find it. It's, like I said, I stole this method from Shepard. What we're going to do is we're going to bring a duo in, a VU meter duo, and we're going to bring that in before the limiter. So it looks like this. Now, first things first, we want to link these and we want to calibrate it. So at the moment this is at -18 dBs. That means that when your needle hits 0, that's indicating that your signal is -18. We want to, the sweet spot that Shepard talks about is -10. So we want to drag that up until it says -10. Now when I push play, let's bring the gain of the limiter right down to 0 again. Just type it in. Right, what I'm going to do here is what my aim is this needle here, and this needle here, both needles, I want to be generally around the 0 mark, every now and then going into the red, but not often. In order to do that, you can do this two ways. You can bring in a gain, like a utility before this, and lift the gain up. But I find the better way of doing this is with this little button here. So what I did there was I accidentally clicked inside this section that kind of changes the skin. So that's pretty good. I'm hitting it around about 0 every now and then going into the red. Now what we want to do is, while that's happening, we've got this properly gained. We can have a look down here at our limiter, and you'll notice that it's just kissing the way we had it before. We're at 0 dBs here, but it's just kissing. So what we essentially have is the sweet spot. So now we have, let's recap. We have mid-side EQ, giving some air and some upper frequencies to the side, taking some away from the mid, taking less than 30 hertz, anything under 30 hertz out, taking anything with a nice gentle slope, taking anything under round about 200 hertz on our mid, which is number 3, 200 hertz. The dynamics, just catching the peaks at around about 1 decibel each. Then we're making up that gain. Then we're saturating, optional. Then, because we've saturated, we then need to do our initial processing again to catch any added peaks that saturation's done, remove any unwanted frequencies. Then we've widened our mix using a utility and a wet-dry mix. Then, using our VU meter, we've got it so we're hovering around 0 every now and then going into the red, leaving our limiter at 0 dBs, and you'll notice with a ceiling of -1 dB, and you'll notice that only every now and then are we limiting. Some additional steps that you might want to do is this EQ, you might actually want to sculpt this EQ a bit more. Now, probably the best way to do this is to do this EQ first, then add another EQ after it, and do your sculpting here with your normal effect everything EQ. In this stage here, this is where you want to make your music sound commercial. And you can do that by referencing other tracks. Bring in another audio, bring in your track, bypass all your mastering chain. Maybe use this mastering chain on the audio instead of the master, which is what I've done here. And then when you bring in the commercial track, solo it, listen to it, solo yours, listen to it, compare the two, make some EQ moves here to get you closer to where you want to be. Don't ruin your mix. Don't make your mix sound different. Try and get your mix to already sound like, not as loud as, like when you're referencing tracks in your mix, make sure that you're level matching. Make sure that what you're playing out of your master is the same level as the commercial song. Because, like I said earlier, you don't want volume to determine whether something's good or not. You want whether it's good or not to determine whether it's good or not. And the best way to do that is by making sure that each volume is the same. So there, I hope you got something out of that. I'll add links to Ian Shepard, and I'll also add a link to where you can get this VU meter in my description below. And subscribe if you like, and catch you on the flip side. See ya.